Trash like you doesn't belong here. Those words hit harder than any blow, and they set in motion a chain of events that would shatter one woman's career and expose truths no one expected. On a seemingly ordinary Tuesday morning, Judge Marcus Reed, a man who had dedicated a quarter-century to upholding justice, walked up the courthouse steps carrying a briefcase of critical judicial orders. But to Chief Evelyn Parker, he was nothing more than another black man in the wrong place. She didn't see a federal judge. She saw only what her bias demanded, and in a moment of raw aggression, she struck him. She grabbed his throat. She cuffed him like a common criminal right outside her own courthouse. What followed would not just ruin her career, it would unmask a system willing to believe lies over truth, prejudice over principle. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Who was Judge Anthony Carter really? A man whose life had been built brick by brick on integrity, discipline, and an unshakable belief that the law was the one equalizer left in a divided nation. To his colleagues, he was a federal judge of quiet strength, a man who had spent 25 years making difficult decisions that shaped the lives of thousands. To his community, he was more than a judge, he was a neighbor, a mentor, and a living example that justice could still wear a human face. And yet, on that courthouse step, all of that was stripped away in seconds, because in Chief Laura Mitchell's eyes, none of that mattered. Why would a woman with 15 years in uniform, a spotless record, and a reputation for toughness risk everything in a single reckless act of rage? Was it a momentary lapse in judgment, or was there something deeper, a history of decisions, alliances, and unchecked power that made this confrontation inevitable? And what was the shocking revelation inside the courtroom that would not only flip this story upside down, but leave an entire nation questioning the very foundation of justice itself? These are the questions that will take us beyond the surface of a single confrontation and into the heart of a scandal that changed everything. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss our upcoming stories. Judge Anthony Carter was 62 years old, but his presence carried the weight of someone who had lived through generations of struggle and resilience. In court, his voice was calm, deliberate, and firm, the kind of tone that silenced even the most arrogant of attorneys. He had spent much of his career presiding over civil rights cases, and while his rulings did not always make headlines, they earned him something far more valuable: the respect of both colleagues and ordinary citizens who believed in fairness. Outside the bench, he devoted time to mentoring young lawyers, teaching them not just how to argue, but how to stand firm when the truth was unpopular. At law schools across the country, he spoke about integrity, urging the next generation never to trade justice for convenience. To his neighbors, Anthony Carter was more than a federal judge, he was a steady hand in a restless world. Chief Laura Mitchell, by contrast, embodied a very different kind of power. At 48, standing 5'8" and weighing 180 pounds, she commanded a room with the sheer force of her presence. 15 years in law enforcement had hardened her every scar. Every confrontation had added to the armor she wore daily. To many in her department, she was the image of a tough cop who got results. Her arrest record was among the highest in the state, and her rise to chief was a story of relentless ambition. But beneath the numbers was another story whispered in the hallways. Complaints that were dismissed. Citizens who claimed she had used excessive force. Officers who remembered racial slurs muttered under her breath during tense encounters. Most damning of all, a growing perception that Laura Mitchell did not believe justice was blind, she believed it was hers to control. This contrast could not have been sharper. Judge Carter's quiet dignity, his belief in fairness, his faith in the law as a shield for the vulnerable against Chief Mitchell's raw, unyielding reliance on authority, her conviction that power was proven through fear. For years their paths never crossed, but it was almost inevitable that when they finally did, the clash would be violent, public, and unforgettable. There had been warnings. A rookie officer, only months into the force, once remarked in a hushed tone after a tense patrol. "She's good at making her version of the story stick, even when the rest of us know it's not the whole truth." Those words were laughed off by senior officers, written off as the nerves of an inexperienced cop. But those who paid attention recognized the pattern. Laura Mitchell's reputation was not only built on her cases, but on her ability to bury doubts, silence criticism, and rewrite the narrative. The system enabled her because she was effective, because she produced results. Yet, in that blind trust, accountability was lost. Judge Anthony Carter believed in accountability. Chief Laura Mitchell believed in control. And when those two forces collided, it would not just be a disagreement, it would be an explosion waiting to happen. On the morning of the incident, Judge Anthony Carter walked toward the courthouse with his usual composure. The air was cool, the sun had just broken through the clouds, and the bronze nameplate at the top of the courthouse steps caught the light, etched with the words, "The Honorable Judge A. Carter." In his hand was a briefcase filled with rulings he was scheduled to deliver that day, cases that would decide the fate of families, businesses, and civil rights disputes. To him, it was another day of serving the law. To Chief Laura Mitchell, it was something else entirely. As Carter neared the steps, Mitchell positioned herself directly in his path. Her stance was rigid, her expression sharpened into a glare that could only be described as contempt. "Where do you think you're going, boy?" she sneered, her voice carrying enough venom that nearby officers Rodriguez and Davis stopped what they were doing to watch. Judge Carter froze, momentarily stunned, not because he hadn't heard the word before in his life, but because never in his 25 years as a federal judge had someone dared to use it at the very steps of his own courthouse. Calmly, Carter opened his briefcase and reached for his identification. He extended his credentials, hoping reason would prevail. Mitchell slapped them away with an open hand, the sound echoing against the stone walls. Papers scattered into the wind, fluttering across the courthouse lawn like discarded truths. Witnesses gasped as the respected judge bent down to retrieve his documents. But before he could collect himself, Mitchell stepped forward and struck him across the face with the flat of her hand. The impact was sharp, humiliating, and deliberate. The assault didn't end there. With one swift motion, Mitchell grabbed Judge Carter by the throat, pressing him back against the cold stone railing. He struggled for breath, his glasses sliding down his nose, his briefcase falling open on the steps. Officers Rodriguez and Davis watched the scene unfold, smirking. Instead of intervening, they pulled out their phones and began recording, chuckling under their breath as if the public humiliation of a federal judge was nothing more than entertainment. Mitchell barked orders as though she were dealing with a criminal suspect, not a man who had sworn to uphold the Constitution. She twisted Carter's arm, forced him to the ground, and slapped handcuffs around his wrists. With calculated cruelty, she dragged him up the courthouse steps, his knees scraping against the stone, his scattered papers still drifting in the breeze. Above his head, the plaque glared down, reading the words he had earned through decades of service. The Honorable Judge A. Carter. To Mitchell and her officers, it was a moment of domination, a display of unchecked power meant to degrade a man they dismissed as insignificant. They thought they were humiliating a nobody. But in reality, every second was being recorded, and every word they spoke would soon seal their own fate. Chief Laura Mitchell wasted no time after the arrest. Within an hour, her incident report was filed, pages of carefully constructed lies. In her version, Judge Anthony Carter was not a respected federal judge on his way to work. He was, as she wrote, an aggressive male subject who refused lawful commands, presented fraudulent documents, and resisted arrest with force. The report painted him as a threat to public safety, twisting the truth into something unrecognizable. To the untrained eye, it looked airtight. To those who trusted her reputation, it was just another day of Mitchell doing her job. And to her longtime ally, prosecutor Jennifer Walsh, it was the start of a case she was all too eager to pursue. Walsh, who had built her career on tough-on-crime prosecutions and who had defended Mitchell against misconduct whispers before, began preparing charges against Carter. She spoke with conviction in private meetings, insisting this was a clear-cut example of defiance against law enforcement. Her loyalty to Mitchell blinded her to the cracks already forming in the story. Officers Rodriguez and Davis, meanwhile, treated the entire ordeal as little more than a joke. In the locker room, they laughed, replaying snippets of the footage on their phones. Another one off the streets. Davis chuckled. Didn't know judges came with handcuffs. They joked about uploading the video, though both knew better than to risk sharing it outside their circle. In their arrogance, they believed Mitchell's account would shield them, just as it always had. But while Mitchell reveled in the strength of her fabricated report, Judge Anthony Carter sat in silence inside a holding cell. His wrists were raw from the cuffs, his face still stung from the slap, yet his mind was sharper than ever. Carter began cataloging each violation in his head, one by one, as though mentally drafting the opinion of a future case. No Miranda rights had been read. No probable cause had been established. His lawful identification had been dismissed. The report ignored Brady v. Maryland, which required the preservation of exculpatory evidence. Even the initial stop raised questions under Terry v. Ohio. In short, the very laws he had taught for decades had been trampled in broad daylight. When the guard slid the phone toward him for his one call, Carter didn't hesitate. His first call was to Chief Judge Patricia Carter, a colleague and his sister. His voice was steady, not frantic, but urgent enough to make her pause. "Preserve everything," he instructed. "Every second of courthouse surveillance from this morning." She didn't ask questions. She simply gave the order. Within minutes, IT staff were copying every angle, every camera, sealing away the truth before Mitchell could bury it. His second call was to the FBI Civil Rights Division. Calmly, methodically, he laid out the framework of what had just happened. They listened. They recognized the weight of his words. While Mitchell sat proudly at her desk, reviewing her report as though she had written a flawless story, and while Walsh prepared the press release about a belligerent man who threatened courthouse security, Judge Carter was already moving the pieces of a far larger game. The woman who believed she had humiliated a nobody had, in fact, assaulted the one man in the building who not only knew every tool of the law, but knew exactly how to use them against her. Mitchell thought she had crafted the perfect lie. But the man sitting in handcuffs was the one person in the building who knew exactly how to unravel it. The day of the hearing arrived and the courthouse was overflowing. The case had been listed under the name John Doe, a deliberate attempt to strip Judge Anthony Carter of his identity, to paint him as just another faceless man accused of defying authority. The whispers in the gallery were thick, the reporters scribbled in their notepads, and the air was heavy with expectation. On the bench sat Judge Raymond Parker, presiding with the authority of a man who believed he was handling a routine matter of disorderly conduct. What he did not know was that the man before him was not just another defendant. He was his colleague, his equal, and the very man who should have been seated where he now sat. Chief Laura Mitchell entered the courtroom with the same swagger she had worn on the courthouse steps that morning. Her uniform was polished, her badge gleaming, her testimony rehearsed. With practiced confidence, she took the stand and began weaving the narrative she had built into her report. According to her, the subject had approached aggressively, had presented falsified documents, had resisted every lawful command. She spoke of safety, of protecting the courthouse, of being forced to make a hard decision in the heat of the moment. Her tone was steady, even convincing to those who didn't know the truth. In the gallery, officers Rodriguez and Davis exchanged grins, certain that Mitchell's word would once again hold more weight than facts. Prosecutor Jennifer Walsh nodded along, underlining phrases in her notes that she planned to repeat in closing arguments. To all of them, it felt like a performance that was going exactly as scripted. But when Mitchell finished, when she leaned back with the faintest of smirks, convinced she had buried the truth once more, the defendant slowly stood. Shackled, bruised, and with his papers clutched against him, Anthony Carter raised his head. His voice was not loud, but it was steady, clear, and unmistakably authoritative. "I have one thing to say," he began. The room fell silent. He paused, letting the moment linger, then spoke the words that changed everything. My name is Judge Anthony Carter, and I preside in this very courthouse. The silence that followed was more deafening than any shout. Pens dropped to the floor. Gasps echoed through the gallery. Prosecutor Walsh froze mid-sentence, her pen still in hand, but motionless. Judge Parker blinked, stunned, realizing that the man shackled before him was not a nameless defendant, but a colleague with decades of service. Mitchell's smirk faltered, her face draining of color as the weight of recognition settled in. Her confident posture stiffened, and for the first time in her career, her hands trembled ever so slightly. In that instant, the power shifted. The woman who believed she had control of the narrative was suddenly standing on the edge of exposure. Every word she had spoken under oath was now positioned against the undeniable truth. She had not subdued a stranger, she had assaulted a federal judge, one whose name was literally engraved on the courthouse wall outside. The hunter had just become the hunted, and Mitchell was about to discover that justice doesn't forget. The revelation detonated like a bomb, and the fallout was swift. Within days, the FBI Civil Rights Division had formally launched an investigation into Chief Laura Mitchell and her officers. The evidence began to pour in, not from rumor, not from speculation, but from hard, irrefutable proof. Surveillance footage from multiple courthouse cameras, carefully preserved by Chief Judge Patricia Carter at her brother's request, showed every moment of the confrontation. Judge Anthony Carter calmly presenting his identification, Mitchell slapping it away, the assault, the chokehold, the humiliation of dragging a federal judge in handcuffs up the steps beneath his own nameplate. Then came the officer's own recordings, those smug videos captured by Rodriguez and Davis, now turned against them as exhibits of arrogance and cruelty. Even more damning, fragments of destroyed legal documents were recovered, papers Mitchell had ordered swept away from the courthouse steps in the aftermath, proof of her attempt to erase the truth. The list of charges grew longer by the hour: assault on a federal judge, filing false reports, perjury under oath, obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and civil rights violations. The case that Mitchell thought she had engineered now stood as an indictment of her entire career. The media descended with a fury. Headlines blared across every platform. Police chief attacks federal judge. Cable networks replayed the courthouse footage in endless loops, dissecting every frame, every word. Editorials called for sweeping reforms in law enforcement oversight, while protesters gathered outside the courthouse demanding accountability. The allies Mitchell once counted on began to distance themselves. Prosecutor Jennifer Walsh, under intense scrutiny, issued a carefully worded statement claiming she had been misled by faulty reports. Officers Rodriguez and Davis, once laughing over their recordings, now faced indictments of their own for perjury and conspiracy. The thin wall of loyalty that had protected Mitchell for years crumbled overnight. She was left standing alone, stripped of her badge, her power, and her narrative. And at the center of it all stood Judge Anthony Carter. In a rare public statement, his words were steady and deliberate, the same tone he had carried for decades from the bench. "I have sentenced many," he said, his voice resonating with the quiet authority of a man who had seen both justice and injustice firsthand. But today, the system judged itself, and it found the truth. Those words cut deeper than any ruling he had ever given, because they exposed the fragile balance between power and accountability, and reminded the nation that even those sworn to uphold the law are not above it. The final image was one that stunned the country. Chief Laura Mitchell, once feared, once untouchable, once convinced that her word alone could rewrite reality, was led away in handcuffs. The same courthouse steps where she had mocked and brutalized a man she thought was powerless now became the stage for her downfall. The crowd outside erupted, some in anger, some in relief, as she was placed into a waiting vehicle. For years, she had ruled by intimidation, but in that moment, she was just another defendant, swallowed by the very system she thought she controlled. A single act of arrogance destroyed Chief Laura Mitchell's career and exposed a network of corruption that had been ignored for years. The assault on Judge Anthony Carter didn't just end a career, it forced the system to look at itself in the mirror. But here's the bigger question. Was justice truly served? Or was this just one rare victory in a much larger battle that still rages in courtrooms and precincts across America? Should officers who abuse their power face even harsher punishment than ordinary citizens? Should public trust violations carry a heavier price? Or was Mitchell's downfall enough to send the message? We want to hear from you. Drop your thoughts below. If you believe accountability matters, type justice in the comments right now, because every voice, including yours, makes the difference. And if you thought this story was shocking, wait until you hear our next one, a tale of power, betrayal, and a twist you won't see coming. Trust me, you will not believe what happened in that one. Subscribe now because you don't want to miss it.